Hey, Bitcoin wealth builders. Welcome to episode 66 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. There has been a plethora of announcements in terms of the race to accumulate the last Bitcoins, whether that be Treasury from corporates or whether that be individuals figuring out that they need to buy Bitcoin, or whether it be sovereign nations seeing that they need their Bitcoin strategic reserves. We're going to be covering everything that happened this week in Bitcoin. There were some really big court rulings, which are very significant. We're going to be covering all the latest and everything in Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 66. So, if you are new to the show, welcome. My name is Simon Dixon. I spent the last 2 decades supporting people in Bitcoin investing in money and obsessing over the topic of Bitcoin investing and money. Bitcoin came later. But before that, I was working on monetary reform. And every week we go live in order to cover what happened this week in Bitcoin, in the macro side and the geopolitical side. And a lot happened this week, as always. So we're going to do the breakdown into 3 sections. We're going to first cover the Bitcoin side, then we're going to jump into the macro, and then we're going to be covering what happened geopolitically, because the geopolitics is what really is driving the utility of Bitcoin in the long term. So let's cover a little bit of what we'll be doing, and then we'll dive straight in. So in the Bitcoin section, we'll be mainly focusing on the Treasury and the strategic reserve announcement and everything else that happened this week. In the macro section, we're going to do a bit more of a deep dive. We cover it every week on the impact on the macro side as we transition from a Biden administration and a Trump administration, and out all roads lead to inflation. And there was a massive announcement in the Middle Eastern side with the Lebanese ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel, but there was also big escalations in both Syria and Russia. I'm going to make sure that you understand what that means and why the ceasefire is not exactly what it seems when you understand the history and follow the money. And of course, we never listen to our politicians at Bitcoin Hard Talk. This is the hardest talk about the hardest form of money. And so we follow the money, not the words, because those following the words will always get it wrong because you are lied to so much in the traditional media. So without further ado, let's jump straight into this week in Bitcoin. So the latest countries that are looking at the Bitcoin strategic reserve, very significantly, Brazil. Now, Brazil geopolitically was obviously involved in a lot of political interference, as we saw Elon Musk on X put out a lot of trying to interfere in the campaign in Brazil. That is obviously strategically aligned with America's, Central America and Southern America strategies, with both Brazil, with Milei in being installed in Argentina, and also the coup that was attempted in Venezuela recently. This is making sure that those assets are used for the benefit of US strategic interest through the International Monetary Fund debt slavery. But anyway, the Bitcoin chamber of, what do we call it? Deputies, the Bitcoin Chamber of Deputies, he's announced a bill in order to establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve. As America gets more involved in your politics, as political interference tends to happen, you know that you get a knock on the door from the IMF and the CIA. And at that moment, you definitely want your Bitcoin strategic reserves, so you can free yourself from the outside interference of your central bank, which is normally used to inflate your currency to pay your dollar debts from the economic hitmen at the International Monetary Fund. So congratulations, Brazil. Make sure if you are in Brazil that you are involved in making sure that bill passes, because those that have the Bitcoin strategic reserves will be hopefully on the right side of whatever the order comes next after the geopolitical section, as we break it down week to week. Who else made some announcements? Well, Switzerland passed a legislation, and that was to study how Bitcoin mining can be used in order to make efficiencies in the grid, balance wasted electricity in the grid, and use Bitcoin mining in order to make sure that they are running at their optimum with wasted energy. And this is something that's happening, really led the way within Texas through the cartelment in America. And now Switzerland is introducing a bill in order to explore the same. And that is a very, very important thing in keeping Switzerland the neutral area that it is. Well, really, it's controlled by the Bank for International Settlements, which is a Rothschild bank with 157 central banks as members in order to create economic carnage through economic hitmen all around the world as a conduit for repurposing countries' resources and ensuring that they are enslaved to US dollar debt slavery so that their governments end up lending and holding all of their reserves in US treasuries so that the US government gets all of the debt to prop up the military industrial complex in the debt-based US dollar Ponzi scheme that was modeled upon the Bank of England's GBP debt-based Ponzi scheme, which is why it becomes important for Switzerland to establish, if it ever wanted to expel the Bank for International Settlements, which has its own army and its own police and its own jurisdiction within Switzerland, if it ever wanted to expel the Rothschild banking cartel, which is building Enbridge, a network of central bank digital currencies, then Switzerland could build its own strategic Bitcoin reserve by harnessing the Bitcoin mining industry and using efficiencies in wasted energy to actually end up with Bitcoin. We saw the presidential candidate who wanted to, we're seeing more and more political, using Bitcoin and crypto as a mechanism for supporting upcoming political parties and candidates. And so we saw the presidential candidate that pledged to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve in Poland. Poland is an ex-communist state that, has been through the Cold Wars and transitioned out of communism. We're going to be covering a little bit about that in the history section when we do the geopolitical side, because we want to understand exactly what is happening in Syria, in Russia, and how that relates to China and everything that's happening within Iran and Ukraine, so that we can get ahead of the curve and we can make sure that we're protected as more and more countries protect themselves through what's going next. Poland has a very good crypto asset regime. At Bank to the Future, we recently applied for our virtual asset registration at Poland so that we can support EU customers in the future that want to protect themselves from the central banks in a world of Bitcoin AI and central bank digital currencies. So Poland, congratulations. If you have a change of leadership, there is leadership that wants to implement strategic reserves in Poland in order to make sure that you never get caught in the middle of a Cold War between communism and capitalism ever again, and you can stay sovereign with your Bitcoin reserves and expel the central bank and the member of the Bank for International Settlements that drove you into a debt-based Ponzi scheme, as with all countries that end up on the wrong side of the economic hitman at the International Monetary Fund. We also had Vancouver Mayor. The Vancouver Mayor came out this week and proposed a motion for the city to adopt Bitcoin as a reserve asset. So if you're not getting it at the federal level, or the over whatever it is in your region, jurisdiction, you may be able to get it at the state level as well, which is what is happening across America as more and more states in America are preparing to announce their strategic reserves. In terms of Hong Kong, which is recently has its own parliament and government, part of the One China policy. I used to live there when all of the riots were kicking off. But Hong Kong, if it wants to remain independent, it is also part of the Enbridge Bank for International Settlements central bank digital currency betas that are happening right now, which will drive us to this one central bank digital currency if they get their evil way. But we can resist with Bitcoin, obviously. But Hong Kong has decided that it will be removing capital gains tax on Bitcoin and crypto for hedge funds and family offices. And it wants to become a global Bitcoin and crypto hub. It was reported in the Financial Times. And so Hong Kong has always had favorable structures that also allows for those wealthy tycoons in China to set up certain structures to be able to get exposure to Bitcoin in a tax efficient way, as well as various other benefits that brings. So Hong Kong is looking to continue along those lines. They launched their Bitcoin ETFs. And we're getting more and more countries that are now competing for the world's capital to be injected into Bitcoin via their jurisdiction. Now, one of the big advantages of Hong Kong is when I used to live there is they don't tax your global wealth. They only consider the income that you receive within Hong Kong. And so now making it where hedge funds and family offices are able to invest in Bitcoin in a capital gains tax-free environment is a very sensible move in order to make sure that the Hong Kong can harness the power of Bitcoin now. Announce your Bitcoin strategic reserves. Try it. You might like it because it is going to become really important, as I believe China is in the first stages through BRICS of also embracing Bitcoin as a speculative thing from my side. I think that will be coming in the years ahead. On where did we have? So that is all of the different countries. Now, remember, if you are building a Bitcoin strategic reserve, you're not going to be announcing it until you built your position, unless you want to be attracting global capital into your country. So how many countries are trying to front run the legislation that for America to have its Bitcoin strategic reserve, to be able to create an independent reserve, independent of the interference of the Federal Reserve as well? How many people are doing that right now? These are the ones that are being announced, but we don't know about the ones that aren't announcing it. We will obviously track that every week in Bitcoin Hard Talk. Now, let's have a look at the corporate side. So leading the charge, as always, we've always been covering MicroStrategy. As a reminder, in July the 3rd, 2002, after the dot-com boom and bust, when my father lost all of his retirement, lost his entire wealth in the dot-com boom and bust, asked me to figure out what happened to his money. And I've told my story often. That was when I really started uncovering the monetary system and ended up in Bitcoin. And thankfully, Bitcoin saved my father. He passed away in 2022, the same day that Celsius actually locked lots of creditors out of their lifetime savings as well. So that is why I spent so much time supporting the victims. And there were a few updates that we'll be covering today as well, if you are a Celsius creditor. But that really drove the story, because Bitcoin is now being used to be able to protect pensioners in the pension Ponzi, which is really being driven the immigration regime at the moment, because the demographics are stating that their birth rates are collapsing at the moment. So immigration is being used in order to earn tax. That tax is being used to solve the pension crisis. As a result of World War II, when all the baby boomers were having baby, they're all retiring, and is creating a demographic crisis globally right now. Immigration is being pushed forward as the solution, but we are moving to a more deglobalized environment based upon all of the war moves that we'll be covering in the geopolitical section. To protect the company, MicroStrategy, just after the dot-com boom and bust, it was the stock went to an all-time low of 42 cents as a result of that. Now, it survived, and it pivoted its strategy to a Bitcoin Treasury asset strategy, which is currently being copied by approximately 100 SEC filings, according to people that are tracking this right now, as many public companies are looking to replicate the process and protect themselves from the inflation that is inflicted upon their dollar reserves through a deflationary Bitcoin strategic treasury reserve for the corporations. But yesterday, the share price, it had a little bit of correction today, reached $421 as a result of their Bitcoin strategic treasury strategy. That's a 1,000x return simply by embracing Bitcoin and using its ability to take its public stock and raise in the fixed income debt market from fixed income investors that can't get exposure to Bitcoin because they can only invest in bonds, but they can use MicroStrategy's debt strategy in order to create this exposure to Bitcoin while it uses that debt in order to buy Bitcoin. Now, me, I am very anti-leverage, and so I personally don't participate in MicroStrategy, but it has outperformed Bitcoin for those that like to degen and get a little bit more exposure. And for those that are crazy, which I do not recommend, they're using the options market in order to create bets on it and all sorts of stuff as more and more hedge funds enter the industry. And MicroStrategy is now one of the highest volume traded stocks in the world and the highest performing stock that even beat Nvidia, powering much of the artificial intelligence. But it was powered by Bitcoin, and it even beat the incredible amount of growth that Nvidia has by powering artificial intelligence through its data centers. MicroStrategy acquired and announced to it, as a result, another 55,500 Bitcoin that it acquired for approximately $5.4 billion just in the weekend after the last episode of Bitcoin Hard Talk. The average price it paid, $97,862 per Bitcoin, knowing the value of Bitcoin into the future as the world's scarcest asset the world has ever seen because of its fixed monetary policy. So now MicroStrategy within its company owns 386,700 Bitcoin that it acquired for approximately $21.9 billion at an average price now told in at 56,764 Bitcoin. Every single person can do a version of this if they want, and they don't even need to get involved in the leverage. For years, ever since I spoke at the first Bitcoin conference in 2011, when I made my first purchase at $3, I have been encouraging everybody to, without financial advice, own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. Do it every single month for at least 4 years, and then you will be valuing your wealth in Bitcoin, not dollars, not fiat currency, not pound, not euros. And once your mindset is around that, they have been competing for the final Bitcoins. And if you were doing it like I have been doing it, disciplined, then you will be in a life-changing financial position today. And I'll continue to do this because I also see the value that MicroStrategy sees in owning and competing for the final Bitcoins as they get mined over the decades ahead. So, but the reason that I tend to prefer Bitcoin, but why are people buying MicroStrategy? Because there is a regulatory arbitrage, as the traditional financial system was not prepared for the success of Bitcoin. The SEC tried to take the industry down. It tried to create the 2023 bank run crisis. It tried to use the Fed in order to take the industry, allow lots of scams to continue, and then crash the scams, paint Bitcoin in a very, very bad light, even though it was, not those companies, and through then hand the industry over to the traditional financial players that it always likes to have, because they needed to adjust. Why? Because they thought we were a scam. They thought we were a Ponzi scheme. They tried to take down Bitcoin and say it's all about the blockchain and build their own blockchains. They missed the boat. And so they needed to use the Federal Reserve in order to accumulate as many Bitcoins, because they were late to the table when Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, used to call Bitcoin a scam and a currency just for drug dealers. Now he is telling the world that it is a protection strategy to all of the different fund managers. But fortunately, because Bitcoin operates off proof of work rather than proof of stake, it doesn't matter who owns it, because we've already seen that whoever owns it does not control the network. They can try to manipulate the price short term, but they get wrecked if they do that in the wrong way, because Bitcoin is scarcer and harder to manipulate long term, even if you can manipulate it short term. Okay, so why are people buying MicroStrategy? Well, at the moment, British citizens, I gave Boris Johnson a Bitcoin strategy in 2013. They didn't listen. And now Britain is scrambling to catch up, and they're launching their own ETFs. But at the moment, British citizens can't really buy Bitcoin ETFs yet because the regulators are trying to catch up. So people are buying MicroStrategy instead as a proxy for Bitcoin within their pension, because the banks and the regulators are trying to catch up as they scramble to try and get those Bitcoin. None of this is factored into the price from my perspective, because they're not able to do it. They're buying MicroStrategy instead. They have to speculate on MSTR, and MSTR does it. And this is the regulatory arbitrage that we're seeing. Same for countries like Singapore. They've been crypto friendly for a while. They had crypto hedge funds. They had the disaster from Three Arrows Capital, which was lending money to Celsius, which was borrowing money from Celsius, borrowing money from Alameda, which was a division of FTX, borrowing money from BlockFi. They YOLO'd and they over leveraged into the arbitrage between GBTC, which was only existed because the regulators didn't approve the ETF. It went from a massive premium to a massive discount. This led to a hike in Fed rates, as a result of not predicting transitory inflation. This then led to the crash of the scams that were trying to pretend to be decentralized, like Terra Luna, that had to they were backing their stable coin by Bitcoin. They had to sell a bunch of Bitcoin. That crashed the price of Bitcoin. That then crashed the arbitrage from a premium on GBTC to a discount. And then this took down hedge funds like Three Arrows Capital, which then exposed the scam artists like the Israeli Ponzi scheme, Celsius, and the SBF Ponzi, that was stealing client money, FTX, and BlockFi, which was overexposed to FTX and took down the industry, exposing the Ponzi's as a result of this. And so Singapore is now late to the market, but they're catching up and embracing the industry. Now the Fed gave a chunk of Bitcoin over to BlackRock, Fidelity, and Bank of New York Mellon approved them as a custodian by using regulatory arbitrage in order to catch up. We don't need to do any of this. If you have been watching Bitcoin Hard Talk, you front run the whole thing because you were prepared, as I was prepared from 2011, to protect ourselves for this moment. And it is not too late as well. But also South Korea, they were involved in the pump and dump of the ICO boom and bust. People were buying XRP. They weren't buying Bitcoin. That took XRP up, pumped it right down. Lots of people got wrecked. That created all the ICOs and tokens. And then the regulators in South Korea said, what the hell is going on here? And now they're catching up. And so South Koreans and Singaporeans are putting in their retirement plan MicroStrategy instead. What about the financial institutions that were saying Bitcoin's a Ponzi, Bitcoin's a scam? Now they're all catching up. And so they're trying to get their compliance teams to sign off. And so their customers can't buy Bitcoin yet. But Goldman Sachs is trying to get it, where their compliance team signs off on it. And Merrill Lynch and Morgan Stanley, they're all subject to the bank regulation. And Biden overwrote the regulation that stopped the banks getting into Bitcoin so that they could hand the industry over to BlackRock and the others that were meant to get the head start. And now those banks and financial institutions, they'll be getting in through the Bitcoin ETF. And all of them will be coming through as they scramble to catch up as well. They will start offering those ETFs, and they wanted to do it in a tax efficient way. So all of those people that have 401ks, they'll be able to put Bitcoin in their ETF that then goes out to all the pension industry, all the registered investment advisors. All of them are scrambling to catch up, and we get to front run them because we can move faster than their compliance department. And we do it the way that Bitcoin was designed, in self-custody, so that when the government decides to confiscate all the Bitcoin from these ETFs in World War III, if that happens, as it did in previous the Great Depression, which was created by the Federal Reserve. If the Fed decides to create the next Great Depression, they can confiscate the Bitcoin from the ETFs, the Bitcoin from MicroStrategy, nationalize it in case they don't start to build their strategic reserve assets this time and other countries do it ahead of them, which is why it's important to get the America building its strategic reserve so it doesn't need to confiscate all of the Bitcoin from MicroStrategy nationalization or through executive orders as they did previously for gold in 1933 in America. But you're going to not be subject to that because you're going to own your Bitcoin in self-custody without a bank or without an ETF or without a financial institution. And you're going to be able to spend it person to person without government permission. And then you'll get the protection from the fixed money supply of Bitcoin as you dollar cost average in each week and make sure you have more Bitcoin this month than the previous month as well. Anyway, so it's all these regulatory reasons that people are essentially buying Bitcoin through MicroStrategy, paying 3 times the value for it, and then they're using derivatives in order to speculate. And that is driving a lot of the volume. And that is creating the large public company FOMO, where more and more companies are now saying we need some Bitcoin in our treasuries, leading up to the vote from Microsoft that we've been covered in previous ones. But this is creating the demand for more and more shares. And that is, allowing people to create hedges and all sorts of stuff. I've seen more and more companies doing it. In fact, this week, I was invited to do a podcast interview from years ago, over a decade ago. I went and spoke at a conference from Roger Hamilton, who's the CEO of Genius Group. And I presented Bitcoin there. And that was when they were covering AI and singularity and all sorts of stuff. But now when he invited me on the podcast, he said that they have already started building their Bitcoin strategic reserve for their listed company. And they're going to be raising finance in order to get more Bitcoin as well and see if they can do a smaller version of the strategy and do a recovery for these public companies that haven't been performing too well. This will be an interesting one for us to watch. Can you turn around a dying company rather than going into liquidation, turn it into a Bitcoin treasury company? We shall see if it scales, but Bitcoin are now using it. It was the model that we created at Bank to the Future when we set up the very first Bitcoin mining-backed security in 2014 that was paying daily dividends for those that wanted to get Bitcoin dividends. We also use that in order to support venture capital funds that wanted to integrate Bitcoin into their funds from 2015 and 2016 and beyond. And in 2016, at Bank to the Future, we used it to support victims of the hack of Bitfinex by structuring it around Bitcoin and giving people exposure to that as well. Maybe this can be a tool that other public companies will now be using. We had another publicly traded company, Metaplanet. They raised $62 million, it was announced this week, in order to purchase more Bitcoin. And we had the competitor to YouTube, Rumble, which is touted as a freedom of speech platform. We got a little Rumble channel. By the way, look me up on Rumble. If we ever get chucked off YouTube, we'll make sure that we're doing all of the live streams in Rumble. But do me a favor, head over to Rumble and hit the follow button. Look me up, Simon Dixon, hit the follow button. We're going to start to do maybe some exclusive content on Rumble as a protection in case YouTube continues to not like what I cover in the geopolitical section. For now, also, so please help me build a following there as well. If you like my content, hit the follow button on Rumble. But Rumble announced that it is launching its Bitcoin strategic treasury. And Rumble is going to be allocating to periodic purchases. It is going to be buying more of Bitcoin as well. And initially, it will be buying up to $20 million of Bitcoin for Rumble. Now, Rumble is an interesting one. Now, while it is centralized, remember, Bitcoin saved Julian Assange in WikiLeaks when it was exposing everything that we know today, like the Hillary Clinton leaks that helps us understand what America and the CIA were doing in the deep state when they were committing atrocities. Very relevant to what we'll be covering in the geopolitical section today, when we cover exactly what it means with the Syria-Russia escalation and how that relates to the ceasefire in Lebanon right now, so you can stay ahead of the curve. But freedom of speech was preserved by WikiLeaks allowing anyone to leak documents, and that was supported by Bitcoin as well. And now Rumble might be able, now the price increase of Bitcoin meant that WikiLeaks still exists today as the Bitcoin community got behind it. Will we get behind Rumble? Will we support them in their stock to build Bitcoin strategic reserves? Will that become important in the battle for censorship into the future? All stories we will continue to cover as Rumble gets into Bitcoin as well. There was another stock called SOS, very appropriately named ticker, and the price went up 100% after it announced that its plans to purchase up to $50 million worth of Bitcoin, and they are essentially a Chinese-based, company. They get involved in, I'm not familiar with what it does, but it touted itself as a blockchain company. They're involved in cryptocurrency mining and commodity trading as well. China is still big in the Bitcoin mining industry, the largest producer of ASICs, and chips that are produced in Taiwan are used in order to support Bitcoin mining, to repurpose energy, with countries like Switzerland that are now looking to use Bitcoin mining to repurpose reinvestment in nuclear energy and renewable energy, as they are able to cartel wasted electricity using Bitcoin, as covered as well. The other Bitcoin miner, speaking of Bitcoin miners, the largest publicly traded Bitcoin miner in the US, trade on NASDAQ, Mara, it bought another $67 million worth of Bitcoin. It cannot mine them fast enough, so it's buying them instead, after buying approximately $551 million worth of Bitcoin last week. This means that all of the new miners that are mining Bitcoin, and immediately these companies are snapping them up, and this is the supply and demand squeeze that we're having as less and less Bitcoin is being mined as a result of the way that it was designed as a deflationary currency, that if you price anything in Bitcoin, it is over the long term smash the hell out of that price as all assets go to zero relative to Bitcoin, whether it be treasuries, real estate, stocks, altcoins, or anything. So Marathon Digital now holds 34,794 Bitcoin worth $3.3 billion as it continues to mine more Bitcoin and give people exposure to that through the public markets as well, for the regulatory arbitrage for those that can't get exposure. And so that is what is happening on all of these Treasury strategic reserves and sovereign Bitcoin reserves. And we'll keep updating as more and more gets announced and we know more around it. But you can and still can front run the whole thing by building your own strategic reserve in Bitcoin to protect yourself in a world dominated by Bitcoin AI and central bank digital currencies that I've always been predicting in the Bitcoin Hard Talk podcast. So if you like that, we've got a few more stories to cover on the Bitcoin side, but do me a favor. If you're enjoying this, like, retweet, repost, make sure more and more people understand what's happening. And that will help me as well cover more content into the future. That's all that I ask. A quick share, a repost, and a like if you think this is good content. Right, what else happened? Now, in America, the U.S. court, this was a really big case. The U.S. court appealed and determined that the sanctions that were placed upon Tornado Cash is a self-custody mixing wallet, which means that people are able to download it onto their device and they're able to use it to mix coins in order to give themselves more privacy. And this, what happened is the U.S. Department of Justice came after the developers of Tornado Cash, saying that they are responsible for how users use their their wallet, even though they have no control, because you can download the wallet and people are doing it through self-custody, peer-to-peer, and it gets mixed and anybody can use it. Legitimate people can use it for privacy enhancement when they want to obfuscate transactions in order to make sure that they protect their own personal privacy. And obviously that means that unlawful actors can use it as well. And they were trying to paint the blame on the developers of the application. This is a slippery slope down to making sure that nobody develops freedom and privacy enhancing technology. For example, the next target would be Bitcoin in self-custody, which is how you protect yourself from the oppression of the government and create this equilibrium balance, which was the whole point in the US Constitution, to protect you from the government. But it was determined that this is unlawful. Now, say what you want about Ethereum. You know, I invested in the Ethereum ICO. I still continue to use it in order to generate income through staking on Bank to the Future. I then convert those stakes to Bitcoin and I compound it as part of an investment bucket. And that's not an alternative to Bitcoin. That's an enhancement when you start to manage these things anyway. But Tornado Cash was in the Ethereum ecosystem. The same happened to Samurai Wallet, which is in the Bitcoin ecosystem. So these cases were deeply connected, whether you like Ethereum or not. It is very important to track these cases because they can have a slippery slope onto the true benefits that Americans can have from the self-sovereignty that Bitcoin gives you as well. So this is really good thing that this the judicial stood up and said this is unlawful. But you need to be very careful because it is in moments of war that they change all these laws. They give you in moments of fear Patriot Acts, and those Patriot Acts take away your freedom because Congress can still take away your freedom. But in this case, the judicial branch stood up for your freedom and said, if Congress wants to change the law, that's up to them, but it cannot be enforced through the judicial branch. It has to be enforced through the process of changing those laws as well. So the system worked in this case, and it was in 2022, and they tried to blame the developers for $7 billion of money laundering because approximately $455 million of the transactions were linked to North Korean hacking group, which is Lazarus, and they tried to pin it on the developers to scare everybody from creating innovation for people to be able to own their own money. It didn't work. So keep watching these cases, and I'll make sure I cover them every week in Bitcoin Hard Talk as well. The language that came from the judge was that self-executing smart contracts are outside of the jurisdiction of OFAC. OFAC is the one that in America holds the record of sanctioning wallets, sanctioning countries, sanctioning companies in line. And that means all financial institutions have to follow US sanctions. You know, there is also this happens in the UK and the United Nations as well. But in this case, it was determined that self-executing smart contracts are outside of the jurisdiction of OFAC and regulatory authority, so developers can continue to build. And this is a victory for self-custody. It is a victory for privacy. And the judge said that, you know, updating the laws is a task and responsibility of Congress, not the judicial branch as well. It was Coinbase that actually supported Tornado Cash developers financially. Coinbase is a public company. It originally raised finance through Bank to the Future when we contributed in having a secondary market pre-IPO before it went public. Congratulations to all our investors that did well when Coinbase went public. But also Vitalik Buterin is basically, after this ruling, donated another $1 million. He's the creator of Ethereum. It's why Ethereum is so different to Bitcoin, because it's connected with characters and the Ethereum Foundation. But he decided to donate $1 million to Coin Center, who led and were part of the defense and making people aware of the importance of this case. So it's great to see how this all works and comes together. And it is also why we have to make sure we look at these different cases even if you're just into the Bitcoin side as well. Speaking of that, you will remember, I can talk about this publicly because it was all public. One of the things I did was I betrayed my principles of using leverage. I decided with 1% of my Bitcoin in 2022 earlier to try and borrow against my Bitcoin rather than selling Bitcoin. I took out a collateralized loan and ended up with a bunch of Bitcoin on Celsius. And then what I did is I put more Bitcoin into Celsius in order to cover the interest on the loan with the yield that's generated, and ended up in that Ponzi scheme. I ended up with a $20 million claim in the bankruptcy across different entities, and as one of the 7th largest creditors in this case, which is why I spent so much time supporting the other victims as well, and of that, and we just unearthed so much. But there was an announcement from the Litigation Oversight Committee and the second distribution to creditors as a result of the litigation. It's still coming after Alex Mizhinsky, and the other co-founders are all still hiding out in Israel, but we will be suing them all in order to try and bring back additional recoveries through the Litigation Oversight Committee. But as a Christmas bonus, they decided to announce that there will be a $127 million distribution. That's approximately another 2.5% on the US dollar value of your recovery, and it will be paid in Bitcoin, because one of the first things that I did and other creditors did is we fought and got the first case in the bankruptcy where they kept the Bitcoin. That was because I saw what happened in the Mt. Gox bankruptcy in 2014. And I saw the power of what we did in 2016 with Bitfinex. But we managed to fight to do it. So now they are using Bitcoin in order to distribute and make sure that we get any upside as a result of however long it takes to distribute these funds. And so that will be distributed as Bitcoin. If you can't receive Bitcoin, there'll be some dollar part to it. But that gives us another 2.5%. Nothing really to get excited about, but because it will be in Bitcoin, it helps you get back some of that Bitcoin as a result of being involved in that Ponzi scheme. And guess what? Mizhinsky is going to be facing his case in January as well. So the total recovery in terms of dollar value is 60.4% now. And speaking of which, we were taking, it was repackaged. We tried at Bank to the Future to support creditors a lot cheaper. But the corruption of the Chapter 11 system means that everyone that was involved in the bankruptcy that were on the outside, they started creating a public company to give themselves good jobs and pay themselves exorbitant salaries. And one of the companies, Hut 8, which was managing the mining of the fact that Mizhinsky and Celsius borrowed $1 billion from Tether by collateralizing client Bitcoin. It ended up investing in Bitcoin mining, and we ended up with all of those assets. And so we had to try and repurpose them as part of the bankruptcy. A new company was formed called Ionic Digital. Epic failure due to just the sheer corruption of self-dealing, of giving people that were involved in the bankruptcy jobs when they were completely underqualified. But my forecast I released, and many other creditors covered this story as well, that we think that Hut 8 is going to be trying to acquire Ionic because Ionic failed. I remember telling the inexperienced board people, you think it can be public in 3 months? I got so much experience with license applications. Add 2 years to your best estimate. And lo and behold, probably 2 years later, they're still not able to go public. And now Hut 8 is already public, so I'm pretty sure that they're going to be trying to get a deal. So Asher, remember, give creditors the valuation that you said, because you promised that Hut 8 has added additional value to that as well. I will keep covering that story as well. And there may be, that may be a way, because there's 2,000 Bitcoin in Ionic Digital, for Hut 8, who has 9,100 Bitcoin, to be able to get another 2,000 by using this process. and then getting the assets which can support both artificial intelligence and Bitcoin mining and bring through 80,000 creditors to it. But we will keep covering that story, but we were protecting creditors from that as well a long time ago when we started to believe that some of these things are happening. Now, this is all speculation for now, no insider confirmation. Watch this story. We will continue. I posted an update on my blog, simondixon.com. If you're a creditor, I'll do another one before Christmas in December with all of the latest things and how to get your distributions and all that stuff. So make sure you head over to simondixon.com, go to the blog, and you can see the November update. I'll post a December update before the year end as well. Okay, well, speaking of Tether, who was also involved in that, the estate will be suing Tether for their role in getting us in that mess, based upon liquidating some of those Bitcoins through Maszynski's scam that ended up with us having a load of equipment. But we had an announcement from Tether, full disclosure. Tether is associated with Bitfinex. In 2016, Bank to the Future was involved, and so I am a shareholder in Bitfinex as well as the other companies that I mentioned. I try to disclose every time I mention a company as well. But they announced that they are going to be discontinuing EURT, which is the euro-backed stablecoin. The reason for this is because by the end of this year, you have to comply with MiCA, which is the markets in crypto asset instruments, instruments in crypto assets. And they are putting together bad regulations for stable coins. So what can we learn from this? This is quite interesting to watch. So there is the euro-backed stablecoin. Tether has announced that they're going to be discontinuing the token for regulatory reasons. And so we now get to see a framework because of this new shift of how to unwind a stable coin. Remember, the biggest FUD event everyone's talking about is that what happens when Tether unwinds? And I've always said, well, it will just unwind because it is backed by certain assets. Those assets can be unwound. As withdrawals come through, you can service those withdrawals, and you don't create a systemic risk event. And so therefore, it is not something you need to concern yourself with. The initial headline of we're taking down Tether would be a FUD event to try and get you to sell your Bitcoin because it would crash the price. And when it crashes the price, people would realize, actually, this is irrational. Tether can just simply be unwound in an orderly fashion. If you want to do it, in fact, it is not a fractional reserve bank. It is full reserve finance, and that allows companies to be unwound without the FDIC guarantees and the Ponzi scheme of creating inflation to get taxpayers, because it is inherently less risky than banks in terms of it doesn't need the additional government backing and it doesn't create that inflationary type of environment. So we now get to see in real time what actually happens. Well, they said in the announcement, if anyone wants to redeem their EURT, they have to do it by November 2025. And by November 2025, they can go to Tether or they can go to one of the exchanges that mints them, and then they can be redeemed. And then those assets can be, deposited to a bank account, or they can be traded on an exchange to another asset for anyone that wants to do it. You could put it in Bitcoin, and the market just creates more buying pressure for most likely people realizing I want to convert my EURT into Bitcoin, which creates additional buying pressure, or it pushes it into Tether as they do it in the dollar-backed Tether. And we just have this orderly wind down. And so the whole FUD of people, that takes out another thing that people have always said, no, you don't want to buy Bitcoin because Tether's pushing up the price. Well, we can see if it's backed by the assets. We can do an orderly wind down. All good. So they've also said that they will stop minting any new EURT, and we will see. Is this an easy unwind process? Will it be easy to make those withdrawals? Will they have to sell down assets in order to cover that? But essentially, this is also another interesting thing that we get to learn about our sector as well. because Tether said they're closing down EURT, but they didn't say anything about USDT. Now, this means we can get a signal as we watch this regulatory environment unfold that Tether USDT is becoming strategically important to the US government, because it is now up to $135 approximate billion backed by US treasuries. So the government is seeing this as a hedge against the fractional banking system and the Federal Reserve System by being able to issue those bonds direct to a stable coin as well. And that really is why they're probably announcing USDT continues. It also means that maybe that this is being regulated on a currency level. So rather than the European Union or the European regulators, rather than saying, if you use USDT with a European person, that falls under MiCA, and therefore you have to put on-chain KYC, we may get this battle between the US Treasury, the Federal Reserve, the EU regulations, as they try and figure out how they're going to handle non-fractional reserve banking through stablecoins. Countries will want to embrace this because they get to sell their debt and they get to have a non-fractional reserve banking system to compete with fractional reserve banking system as well. And so at the moment, USDT is still open to Europeans, indicating that they believe that as stablecoin regulations get implemented in US, that it will be on a currency basis rather than a per person basis, which is demonstrating again, no systemic crash event is likely to happen. Cantor Fitzgerald, they said that they're buying 5% in Tether. And I think they said that they're buying a 5% stake in Tether for $600 million. Cantor is managing the treasury assets, and they came out and said that everything is backed as well. And so Cantor gets to basically get a stake in one of the most profitable companies in the industry. As that gets pushed to what is stablecoin regulations going to look like in the US, you can bet your bottom dollar, follow the money, that Cantor is going to be using their influence, because the CEO was actually one of Trump's picks for the Commerce Secretary. I need to keep up to date whether that is actually happening or not, because things are moving fast and furious. But now follow the money, and you can start to realize that now Tether is a part of the entrenched establishment, especially through the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, which, by the way, was on top of the World Trade Center. When 9/11 happened, is a pro-Israeli deep state neocon and has all sorts of shady connections to the Mossad operation of those that were connected to the taking down of the Twin Towers as well, as is Trump's new company, World Liberty Financial, which is backed by some Mossad-connected people that lent money to Urban Movers. Urban Movers was the company that was investigated because they were sent by Israel to document 9/11, led to the arrest of the 5 dancing Israelis that were celebrating 9/11 as it happened. And then suddenly it all disappeared from the 9/11 files, and it said, all good, nothing here. When they went back to Israel and did a TV interview, they confirmed on national TV that they were sent in order to document the falling of the Twin Towers before it actually happened. But we're told that's a conspiracy theory. By the way, I recommend head over to simondixon.com. And on 9/11, I shared a documentary that was created that I think everyone should watch to understand some of the trends, especially as we go further and further into the Trump administration's promise of exposing the deep state. I don't believe he will follow the money, and you'll know why. And I've covered that in previous broadcasts. But he did promise he would release the 9/11 file, which would release everything that I just explained to you that was wiped from history. But fortunately, the archives were documented, and they can take away all those redactive Israeli Mossad operations that wanted you to believe that it was just a crazy group of people that were in a cave in Afghanistan, acting on their own in order to violate the most intelligent, and most advanced intelligence agencies in the world. Yeah, sounds like a likely story when it came down as a controlled demolition as well, rather than the plane falling into it. Anyway, the final part in the Bitcoin section started to get ahead on the geopolitical section, is Trump basically is favoring the pro-Bitcoin regulator of the Commodities and Futures Trade Commission, and that will oversee the cryptocurrency, and maybe even do it instead of the SEC. The candidates that were head of the SEC as well, now that Gary Gensler is retiring, is also crypto and Bitcoin friendly. So this marks a new era, which is, if you remember when I said, would I vote for Trump? But even though for the geopolitical reasons, I don't think it will make a reason. I don't think he'll come up against the deep state. I'm not that ignorant. But for Bitcoin reasons, he can give people the tools to free themselves. And then you can use these tools and some of the bills like Bitcoin strategic reserves to free America from the Federal Reserve and Thomas Messie's End the Fed bills, which brings us into the macro section. We're going to have a smaller macro section today. We're going to be covering that, and then we'll go into the geopolitical section. So this is where I take a very, very quick water break to refresh my voice so that I can remain fresh. And what I like you to do, if you're enjoying this content, we're going to be doing the macro, then we're going to be doing geopolitical. All I ask from you is the algorithms, what I cover, the truth. Many people like to censor the truth. So I need you to hit the like button. I need you to put a comment, especially if you're watching the recording. And I need you to repost or even tag me on X, wherever you are, wherever you're watching this. Please do that for me right now. Repost it. Help me get more eyeballs to it so that I don't get taken down because it's more and more popular. So please do that after 3. I'll take a quick water and then we'll get into the macro section. 1, 2, 3. Hey, let's jump right into the macro section. Going to be a shorter section, and then we're going to be covering much of the history to understand what happened with the ceasefire. Why is Syria entering the equation? How is that connected to what's happening in Russia? How is that connected to China? We'll dig deep into the history so that you can understand what's happening today so that you can follow the money rather than actually just listening to all the lies on the media. Okay, so it was announced that Trump will be imposing a 25% import tariff on both Canada and Mexico, as well as a 10% tariff on Chinese goods. Now, some are saying this is just for posturing and negotiation. I tend to agree because the tariff negotiation is definitely going to tie into the geopolitical negotiation. When you understand the history, I'll make you, I'll tell you my best thinking on how I think this all ties together. Now, remember, intelligence agencies that are responsible for all the drug trafficking ring, human trafficking ring, like the CIA and Mossad, that needed Israel as a jurisdiction to hide their crimes through right to return. Those intelligence agencies with MI6, they created all of these rings, and they took legal drugs from China through the poppy fields and opium, and then they would export it to Mexico, and Mexico would then turn the legal drugs into illegal drugs. And through America's open border policy, which is enforced by the CIA, Mossad, MI6, the deep state, that are funded by the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the Bank for International Settlements, IMF, World Bank, they allow these open border policies so that all the drug trafficking can happen. They can hide inflation. They can make numbers come down through illegal immigration. And I covered last week through replacing illegal immigration with legal immigration, that is inflationary. By implementing tariffs, that is inflationary. By allowing the Federal Reserve to reduce rates so that they can control Trump. And if he doesn't play to the deep state next year, they can hike rates and make him look like he crashed the American empire. That is also inflationary as well. But these is how the drug cartels get things through into America. And by implementing these tariffs, it is a signal against the legal trades that happen there. And we will see what happens if we moves to a closed border policy. The deep state won't like that, a closed border policy. So I think instead, maybe they'll do that, but they'll replace the illegal immigration with legal immigration because the birth rates in America, as they are globally, are going down and down and down. They've got a Ponzi scheme called the pension crisis, called Medicare, and all those social security. And so they need immigration in order to tax more, and then they can do that through legal immigration. We'll see what happens throughout 2025. But anyway, they started saying that there's going to be more and more tariffs on Canada and Mexico that will have a big impact on those trades as well, and points towards doing more trade with China when more trade was meant to go to Mexico. But remember, we covered last week that while Trump is saying that he is committed to peace, he put all the neocon war hawks and pro-Israeli Zionists in his administration. And so they will be setting the agenda, and Trump will be, will he be able to combat that? I doubt it. He said, follow the money, not follow the words. And so I'm expecting, and we'll cover more in the geopolitical section, why I'm expecting escalation, despite the fact that it was painted as if there would be peace. We shall see. And I hope that I'm wrong, because I'd love to see a world where we all start trading again and there are peace negotiations rather than allowing the military industrial complex to profit the shareholders of the Federal Reserve through the bank, criminal gangs that are essentially allowed to persist through intelligence agencies that we always cover when we follow the money. So anyway, Treasury Secretary for the Trump administration, what's his name? Scott Bessemer. Scott Bessemer was announced as he's going to be the Treasury Secretary under the Trump administration. What do we know about him? Well, he is a conduit for the World Economic Forum and what I guess people call the globalists, the corporatists, and the globalization agenda, which would be working in direct parallel to the nationalist agenda that Trump said that he is looking to implement. So what do we know about him? Anyway, he's not a politician. He's a fund guy. He's a hedge fund guy. I remember him through his work with George Soros, so I tried to refresh myself to understand why has he been appointed. Well, he worked with George Soros. He was actually part of the team that made the short GBP investment trade, where George Soros's fund made $1 billion in one day by playing the arbitrage between the GBP and the European Union, and bet against being able to stabilize the pound, and made $1 billion down. He was actually in the team that was responsible for that $1 billion short trade as well. He actually worked for George Soros for 10 years, and he had a relationship with him for 30 years. So this isn't just a small relationship. This is who is in charge and the Treasury Secretary of the Trump administration. In fact, he actually, and it was Soros that actually injected $2 billion into his firm. So Soros was the backer for his hedge fund as well. He injected $2 billion in 2015. And he was also, that's who we've got in charge. That is as deep state, as not really neocon, but more globalist agenda as well. And that is the Treasury Secretary that was chosen by Trump in the Trump administration. So we will see whether he gets to have his nationalist closed border policy. But George Soros is infamous for funding all of the fake riots, funding open border policies. And so appointing somebody connected with George Soros through those deep relationships mean that I will be following the money very carefully, because that implies the opposite of what Trump said he will do as well. So anyway, on the macro side as well, when we follow these large macro trends, on the de-dollarization side, Russia and Iran have announced that they have now completely abandoned the US dollar for all bilateral trade between Iran and Russia, which is where a lot of the oil that China needs come from. And they have both shifted entirely into national currencies. So this is part of de-dollarization and supporting BRICS as it continues to grow. there was an announcement, I quote, "We have entered into a currency agreement with Russia and abandoned the dollar. Now we will only trade in rubies and rials." That came from Iran. And there was an announcement as well that basically we got to what are we trying to put together? So you've got the de-dollarization movement. The de-dollarization movement is a way of creating counter negotiations to Trump's tariffs. China, Russia, Iran have to be strategically aligned through BRICS. And you're seeing, Argentina and Milei as a counterforce that said, I'm not going to be in BRICS. And I'm going to be, essentially dollarizing rather than BRICS. So Milei was injected in order to support a counter move to the China Belt and Road Initiative, to, the multipolarity as America continues to try and complete, its hegemony and become a polar, continue to be a polar, a single polar as well, power as well. So Trump is doing the narrative of what will the Trump administration be. It is drill, baby, drill. Drill, baby, drill is essentially code word for, on the macro side, as America is the largest producer of oil under Saudi Arabia, but it can't export as much as Saudi Arabia because America has a massive population of 350 million relative to Saudi Arabia's 35 million. It means that it's trying to get the price of oil down so that it can throttle the Iranian and Russian economies when you follow the money. So this is a signal that financial weapons of mass destruction are probably where Trump is going to try and get his leverage over the negotiations. But who is Trump really negotiating with? Well, China and America have to trade with each other. If China stops trading, it can take away Taiwanese chips through semiconductor chips through reunification. That would destroy the American economy and the American stock market overnight. Companies like Apple, even defense as well, requires those semiconductor chips in drones and new fighter jets as well. But there is always that threat. But China would much rather trade with America. America is the largest consumer. It needs to continue the debt-based Ponzi scheme to feed the Federal Reserve to create more inflation, which creates more wealth inequality, which allows it to pump the stock market and debt-based Ponzi scheme, and until eventually it ends up in a civil war because all the assets end up in the hands of those that own Bitcoin and own real estate and own stocks, relative to those that are deep in debt and unable to protect themselves and consuming through credit cards. Trump needs to keep that alive. And so therefore, that trade needs to continue as it implements tariffs in order to bring back more protections into America. But those 10% tariffs, he needs to get negotiations with Xi Jinping. And so what are they going to be using? What is the negotiation? He'll say, I won't implement the tariffs if you stop buying oil from Iran and Russia. And so this is what I think the tariff trade is all about. It's not going to be implementing tariffs. It's not an America first agenda to bring back trade into America. I think it is a way of, through the Treasury Secretary, who is a globalist, moving towards making sure that the relationship between China and America can continue trades, not necessarily with tariffs. And the tariff will be used as a chip in the poker game to negotiate China not buying oil from Iran and Russia, so that then Trump can come in, negotiate whatever the ceasefire deal is between Russia and Ukraine. And therefore, the oil supplies becomes less important for Russia, and then throttle and cripple the Iranian economy. And that is why, if you follow the money, all of Trump's administration were all the neocon warhawks that want to go to Iran by having a Israel first policy. And that is why I believe the game is to progress towards Trump delivering regime change and war with Iran. I'll cover more in the geopolitical section. But when we follow the money, we can understand how I think he might be able to do that. That is what I think everyone's putting on the table. And we will watch in 2025 how this gets executed. But in the meantime, protect yourself with Bitcoin. All roads lead to inflation. And Trump is set to be protecting, as we covered in the Bitcoin section, a Bitcoin and crypto friendly environment so you can protect yourself and not have to wait as well. Trump will enforce the sanctions on Iran and get more and more aggressive in order to cripple the economy as well. And China will basically decide if it wants to play in the game. It has the largest oil reserves, and that is how Russia and Iran have been subsidizing their resistance against that. And this brings us into the geopolitical section and why this is so needed, and why did we get a ceasefire right now as we go through the geopolitical section. Remember, we got a ceasefire right now because Hezbollah is essential in order to prevent Israel from committing the genocide and ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And so Iran was funding Hezbollah through Lebanon in order to create it where it kept the self-determination, or at least the Palestinian cause, alive. When you take out Hezbollah, it means that Israel has lost their main reason, because they're on the border together, to be able to keep Israel back from going into direct conflict with Iran, a war they cannot win. But because of the agreements between Israel and the Israeli lobby in America, they can draw America into the war, and they can put US troops on the line in order to make sure that they get the regime change within Israel, because Israel wants control of all of Iran's oil. It wants control over Lebanon and Gaza so it can get natural gas, so then it can power its artificial intelligence based upon the Israeli military-industrial complex, because it's stolen all of America's technology by investing in Silicon Valley, making sure that all the data is going back towards Israel. And that is what this is all about when you follow the money as well. And so what has now been announced in the peace treaty, or the ceasefire, is that Israel can now stop focusing on Lebanon and focus on Iran. And that is why the terms of the ceasefire, and we'll go into the geopolitical section, I just got a little bit ahead of myself. They said there will be a ceasefire between Hezbollah, who hasn't been, their leadership had been taken down, but most of the arms and military is still there. So if they want to reactivate the war with Lebanon, Israel can just fire a rocket from Lebanon, say that it was Hezbollah, and then go back into an invasion again. But they can decide whether they want to do that on the Biden administration or the Trump administration, and they can still play those games, because Trump wants to be able to say, I was the person that said I would put an end to all of this as well. So what did they do? They said ceasefire for 60 days. 60 days is the first week of the Trump administration. Think that's a coincidence? I think not. That was the negotiation between Biden and Trump and Israel, and I don't think it's going to be peace. I hope that I am wrong, but as I said, once you remove Hezbollah, who were protecting from Israel genociding Gaza, then you have removed the check and control by having a ceasefire agreement there, so that Israel can now focus on Iran. And by them focusing on Iran, Iran can draw America in, and Trump can fulfill his promise to Israel that came from all the political AIPAC financing that got him elected. And as I said in previous broadcasts, made him the chosen one to be president after the replacement of Biden with Harris, which was, I always said people thought it was going to be close. I always said Trump would win if you watched all the previous broadcasts, because he is the chosen one by following the money as well. So what you got to watch out for is an Israeli false flag operation to try and get the US into war, so that US can implement regime change in Iran and then Trump will say, no, we're bombing ISIS or something like that, which brings us nicely into the geopolitical section. And also, what do we see? Some announcements as well. Trump is considering, this was hot off the press recently, lifting some of the sanctions on Russia if a peace deal with Ukraine can be achieved. And so we're starting to get some of that posturing, which would create a more stable environment, push the stock markets up to new all-time high. The Fed reduced rates. I still think they will be cutting rates again in December, which will push the stock market up to new all-time highs, increase real estate, and create more wealth inequality, and drive more investment into Bitcoin as more and more people try to front-run the strategic reserves of that as well. So now let's take a quick break. And what we're going to be doing in the geopolitical section is I want to make sure that you are fully prepared for what's going to come in 2025 and understand why the ceasefire happened now, why it was 60 days, and why Syria is suddenly having covert regime change operations with the Mossad operatives, ISIS, and why and how you can get ahead and understand why that suddenly is happening right now. We'll take a look at a map around the world, and I'm going to be covering a bunch of history that I've covered in previous as well, but I want to tie it together so that you are prepared and you can understand the geopolitical section so you can prepare and make bigger, better decisions as well. Right, do me a favor, like, retweet, share. We're going to be covering the geopolitical section next. I'll take a quick water. 1, 2, 3, like, share, repost, comment. Okay. So this week it was announced, it was surprise as well, that there will be a 60-day ceasefire between Hezbollah located in Lebanon and Israel that are on the border, the northern border of Israel and the southern border of Lebanon. The way that the ceasefire was announced is going to work is that it is intended to be a permanent ceasefire, but there will be a 60-day transition period over Christmas and through into the Trump administration. The way it's meant to work is that Hezbollah will move further north from the southern border, further away from Israel. And it's meant to go further north of the, what's it called? The Litani River. Israel is going to be basically retracting from Lebanon in a staged process over the 60 days so that it will no longer have the Israeli army after they failed, to be able to get any real ground invasion. They did incredibly well at killing civilians by air and killing infrastructure, but they did really bad in the ground invasion because Hezbollah led to many, many Israeli soldiers going back in body bags. But their intelligence was superior, so they managed to take out the leadership, but they didn't manage to demilitarize because all of those military weapons still exist, and 80%, Netanyahu made the claim that 80% had gone, while Israel has superior intelligence, superior air, but on the ground invasion, no, and it is not demilitarized. So didn't hit the strategic objective, which is why we got this sudden reversal and sudden, which really took me by surprise as well. I am very skeptical about this. I think that there is a trick. I'm playing some of the chess moves, following the money, and giving you my speculation. But as Israel retreats as well, the Lebanese army will be moving in order to protect the disputed territory in the southern, in southern Lebanon as well. So basically, there's an agreement called 1701, which was a United Nations agreement that was never fulfilled between, it was never actually enacted. And that led to Hezbollah being located there in order to ensure that if Israel ever tried to genocide or ethnically cleanse Gaza, they were trained and funded through Iran, and they're right on the border, which kept the peace, which would then stop Israel being able to bomb Iran and then enter World War III and lead to America having to intervene in order to take out the regime change in Iran. That was, what was keeping the industry in sync before Trump removed the nuclear deal, tore up the nuclear deal, and implemented Abraham Accords to make sure that the Palestinians never had a cause as well. Obviously, that led to October the 7th. Anyway, getting ahead of myself. This was called the 1701 deal. And basically, before, Hezbollah refused this deal and said that we will only implement this deal and fulfill it when Gaza is free and has self-determination. So that has been agreed. That is the current state of affair. We will see if the ceasefire holds, because if any point over the 60 days it escalates, then it goes right back. We saw that happen in Gaza, and I detect that this is about Israel re-weaponizing, which is why Biden is sending tons and tons of money to Israel again, creating more inflation funded by the Federal Reserve and the deep state to bring that money back into America to push the military industrial complex so that the money goes back in the hands of pushing up stock prices and creates more inflation in America, which eventually will send troops over to the Middle East that will come back psychologically traumatized because they realize that they're going to have to fight a battle based upon fake news, which is always leaked upon WikiLeaks, and realize that the reason you thought you were going into war is not the war. That leads to more homeless people in America addicted to drugs because they had to commit heinous crimes against humanity, which now President Netanyahu is a war criminal and has to be arrested if he ever leaves Israel and into anybody's borders as a result of the International Criminal Court case as well. Anyway, there has already been some additional border, and in the hours before the agreement, Israel took the opportunity to bomb the hell out of Lebanon, destroy and kill more civilians, implement more deaths, and they were really bombarding to take out as many as they can, leading up to the agreement and the ceasefire. So far it is held, but there has been some tit for tats. Anyway, what I want you to understand, because immediately after those tit for tats, the news cycle switched to, we don't talk about Lebanon, we talk about Syria. And you are going to see more and more of the news cycle now tell you that there are these crazy jihadi terrorists in Syria, and you are going to be fooled into thinking that they're the same people as any resistance against the occupation. And I want to make sure that you don't get fooled by it by understanding what happened as well. Next year, I'm actually going to be putting a very concise video series to make sure everyone understands this, because if you haven't watched previous episodes of Bitcoin Hard Talk, I want to make sure everybody has a very concise video series that is very clear. A little bit less of me just talking, but nice animation to demonstrate it for those that find it a little bit harder to follow along. But in previous broadcasts, I talked about the history of central banking and how it was set up in order to fund wars. I want to fast forward to the Federal Reserve and take out the key events that help us understand why Syria is next. And everybody needs to be focusing on Syria and what is happening right now. So a little bit of history. Sorry if this is revision for those that are long-term listeners. It's always good to get repetition and understand it. But in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was implemented within America. This was a Rothschild-funded creation after having two central bank charters removed. And it was created as a meeting in Jekyll Island between Rothschild-backed Morgan family, and they were all interconnected through marriage, as well as the Rockefeller family and the Warburg family. And these were all Zionists that were involved in the creation of Israel in order to take those intelligence agencies and create their own jurisdiction, like the Rothschild family did after World War I through the Bank for International Settlements. And Israel was the jurisdiction in order to take all of those criminal intelligence agencies supported drug trafficking ring, pedophilia rings, human trafficking rings, and give jurisdiction for the criminals that they want to have a right to return as well. And obviously victimize very innocent people in there, thinking that they're fighting. And so the Federal Reserve Act immediately led to income tax within America, because it now controlled the right and the profits to create the dollar. That then led to World War I, which was a way of getting America deep into debt now that it controlled, so it could print more money and control the US government and remove it from constitutional America. At the same time, the Rothschild same families in 1917 implemented and got the British government, which was a failing empire, completely bankrupted by war. The Bank of England had completely destroyed the economy by funding both sides of the war and had significant leverage over Winston Churchill in order to drive those wars as well. But in the midst of wars, you get the most oppressive changes in laws because the military take over and the citizens are busy surviving. And so you get massive, massive changes. This is when the Balfour Declaration happened, when Rothschild was declared parts of Palestine to the Zionist entity to support the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Palestinians. At the same time, in the same year, in 1917, the Rothschild family and Jacob Schiff, who was involved in constructing the Federal Reserve as well, and loans through JP Morgan, which was involved in constructing the Federal Reserve as well. They funded the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, transformed their banking system, which had a debt-based monetary system, largest gold reserves in the world, full employment, no inflation, and also 80% of the peasants all owned the land in Russia, and funded the Bolshevik Revolution and replaced the Russian government and the Russian central bank and debt-free state banking system with the Soviet Union and a Rothschild banking system in order to steal all of the assets over a long-term time frame, justifying it through the creation of communism, which was the Karl Marx Communist Manifesto funded by the Rothschild family. So it had control of America through the Federal Reserve, which would slowly bankrupt the American government by controlling the dollar, move it away from constitutional capitalism, and get it to the state where the government is so large and significant indebtedness. And then you can drive US to World War III at the point you want to choose through hiking rates at the Federal Reserve, the tactic that it used in Russia as well. And then it had communism as well through the Bolshevik Revolution. And the Rothschild family could fund both sides of the ideology and drive the world into the Cold War and fund all of those wars, send all the expenditure back to the military industrial complex, and transform all of those gold supplies from Britain, from Russia, and also Germany over to Fort Knox in the Federal Reserve. So in the 1930s, what you're not told is that millions and Russians and Ukrainians were killed, what later became known as Ukrainians as well. They basically died in something you've never heard of before, probably, unless you study this region. I studied it as well. And it was called the Holodomor. And the Holodomor, where millions of Russians and within Ukraine were basically what is now called Ukraine, that was now then part of the Soviet Union. It was a complete human-made famine, exactly like what is happening in North Gaza right now to the Palestinians, where you create complete famine in order to wipe out and kill millions and millions of people. Basically very similar to Gaza today. Now, after the Balfour Declaration, around the same time in Israel, 1917 to 1948, 1948 was when it actually became recognized by United Nations, there was a terrorist Zionist group called Haganah, which is a militia that was injected into Palestine, and they were committing terrorism. They were classified terrorists by the British government that were controlling the region at the time. And these are the same terrorists that later became the IDF. And so they were repackaged once the United Nations gave them statehood into a terrorist group, into the IDF. Many of the family of Netanyahu and the leadership and the extremists in Israel right now, they actually were connected to these families. And they were, basically used Israel in order to get away with all of their war crimes as well. But they were sent in there in order to take as much land from the British-occupied Palestine and ethnically cleanse during that whole region leading up to 1948. Meanwhile, after the end of World War I, 1918 to 1933, this is when you had the Germany Weimar Republic phase. Everyone talks about the crazy hyperinflation. You see people in Germans carrying around barrels. You see people burning books and all sorts of stuff. This is when the economy in Germany was absolutely destroyed. And in 1918, through the Treaty of Versailles, all of the gold from the debt-free monetary system that existed in Germany at the time was repackaged into a Rothschild type of bank. And that created hyperinflation. And all of the debts of all of World War I were negotiated where Germany had to repay it, and they had to repay in gold. So they had to print their currency, and all of the gold ended up in the Federal Reserve and Fort Knox as well. And so this was essentially the Rothschild banking control in the Weimar Republic, Germany. That led to the hyperinflation, that led to gold confiscations as well. And this led to the rise of National Socialism when Hitler came into power, and the rise of Nazism and nationalism and expansionism that came from that in 1933. But in that same time, there was an agreement that was put together. It was called the Havara Agreement. And this was finalized and negotiated between the Zionists and basically it's called the Zionist Federation of Germany. So those Zionists that were in Germany, a shell company for funding Haganah and weaponizing Haganah called the Anglo-Palestinian Bank, which was under the direction of the Jewish Agency, which was another Rothschild, basically, front bank that was making sure that all of this terrorism was getting to the Haganah group. And the economic authorities of Nazi Germany, i.e. Hitler, they signed an agreement that led to the first immigrants into Palestine as well. And so through this agreement, the German Zionists were able to take all of their wealth, convert it, put it in that bank, and then they were able to migrate towards Palestine. And then this funding was able to be used in order to weaponize the Haganah terrorist group in order to engage in the takeover of Palestine, and basically trading all of those assets into the Zionist Rothschild control banks as well. Round about this time, prior to 1948, when they said, Arabs just suddenly waged war on Israel. In 1946, there was the King David Hotel terrorist attack, if you can look it up as well. This was basically by another terrorist group by the Zionists called Irgun. And Irgun joined with Haganah as well. And they implemented a terrorist attack on British forces that made them basically, they were trying to dress up as if they were Palestinians and trying to get the Brits to think that the terrorism was being committed by the Palestinians so that they could expel more and more people. This is the real birth of terrorism and false flag operations. And all of this is declassified documents. Obviously, a lot of history has been rewritten by those that won the side and get to control the propaganda. But they were essentially, those terrorists were disguised as Arab workers in order to try and blame it on Palestine. Now, you will see as we cover, I'm trying to get closer to today, why we're being told to focus on Syria. Have that in the back of your mind, and how this all connects to what's happened in Ukraine and Russia as well. So now we move into 1947. This is when the United Nations Petition Plan was approved. And this is where essentially the Zionist-controlled British government that owed the Rothschild family, because they managed to get America into World War II by getting control of the Federal Reserve and making America deep in debt, getting money back into the military-industrial complex, using these money laundering banks in order to make sure it got the weapons and the terrorist financing within Israel. This basically led to a lot more violence. So the UN petition plan was announced that said these regions of Palestine, They're no longer yours. Get out. We're giving it to Israel. That created a lot of violence, as you can imagine. And in April 1948, the Haganah Group, they implemented a plan which was called Project Dalet. And this is where essentially they would capture the villages and towns. They would commit sexual violence in order to scare people to leave. They would do massive exodus, and they would do forced displacements of all the Palestinian people and population in the land that they wanted to expand their territory to. This created a lot of violence, resistance groups against the Haganah and Irgun terrorists. And in 14th of, May 1948, Israel basically declared itself independent. They had their Independence Day. And then the very next day, after getting Brits to classify, these false flag operations and all sorts of stuff, the very next day, the neighboring Arab states, they all came together and they surrounded Palestine and Israel. And they basically were forced and pushed into this military. And this was the beginning of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. This is where you are being told that the Arabs were just trying to wage war on Israel when it was all being inflicted based upon all the violence and the atrocities that were happening. After that war, the British and the MI5 and the CIA, they obviously got all of their resources behind Israel because this was a front jurisdiction for covering up all of their drug trafficking rings through intelligence agencies. And in 1948, approximately 750,000 Palestinians were made refugees in what they call the Nakba, which is the Palestinian catastrophe. And now Israel said this territory is ours. Where did those Palestinians flee to? And this is where you start to understand what is happening right now, why Lebanon comes into the mix, why Syria comes into mix. Well, they mainly fled to Lebanon. So a bunch of the refugees went to Lebanon. A bunch of them went to Syria, and others went to Jordan. They also were expelled, the ones that were left over, to Gaza and the West Bank. And that's when they, had those different territories. And a violence era continued as there were more and more settlements and expansion into those territories, where essentially the Rothschild-funded banks would acquire land illegally or just expel people and take over land and just start building to make Palestine smaller and smaller and smaller, just like settler colonialism typical strategy. At that time, Lebanon didn't really play a major role in the Arab-Israeli war, and it was mainly different, Arab nations that all came together for Israel's creation, and it ushered in a wave of violence that followed. Now, let's get closer. 1958, I've covered this in previous broadcasts. This is when we had the covert CIA operation. These are many documents that have been declassified on the CIA sites as well. You can find out about these by reading books like Covert Regime Change that explains how America would create different terrorist groups in order to fool people into thinking that they were actually fighting against the terrorists, but the terrorists would be used in order to fight against their regimes. And then they can justify selling more weapons, and from both sides, as we have covered many more. But in 1958, this is when the CIA executed a regime change within Lebanon to install a US puppet government. If you look at the declassified documents, they said that the US funded the coup in Lebanon at this time. They did both covert and overt operations to try and support the pro-Western government at the time, and make sure that the president that they were supporting, which is Camille Chamoun, was in charge, so that they could then use this as a strategic resource for America to destabilize the region with Israel as well. And this was as a result of fear, basically Western fear of rising Arab nationalism. At the time, it was led by Egypt's Nasser. And he was unifying the Arab around, for example, he nationalized the Suez Canal and chucked out the occupying Brits. And this was a bad investment for the Rothschild-backed family and Walt Rothschild that was creating Israel at the time, MI6, the deep state, the jurisdiction. And so at this time, Nasir was fighting back, and it created the United Arab Republic, which was an agreement between Egypt and Syria where they did a merger in order to try and fight back against the Zionist occupations as well. The declassified documents basically revealed the type of strategies that we understand. So you need to see the strategies they've used in the past, follow the money to make sense of what is happening today. But it basically indicated that the US and the Eisenhower administration, they released their doctrine, which has now been declassified, and they were providing financial aid, political support, and covert operations in order to bolster the pro-US puppet government, which is Cameron's government as well. And this was in order to have a strategic tool in order to weaponize against any Soviet Union expansion into the Middle East by creating crisis, using the IMF, and destroying the economy of Lebanon so that they can control the assets. And the Fed they're able to use interest rates in order to get them through the economic hitmen at the IMF deep into debt so that they can destroy their economy at the whims through monetary policy as well. Basically, the US was looking to counter Soviet Union expansion into the Middle East by controlling these governments and creating these different groups and terrorist groups, just like one of the early ones that America backed and created, which was Al-Qaeda as well. And they were created as part of the Cold War so that America could use it against the Soviet Union and create chaos at the borders and ensure that the Middle East was always in a state of war. And now you understand what is being used in the current conflict as well. Let's go a little bit deeper to make sure that we understand it all, and then we can get into what's happening today and why all eyes are on Syria at the moment. So in the 1970s, there was an area of lots of violence between Palestine and the different regions. And within Lebanon, the Palestinian group that was a resistance group against illegal occupation called the Palestinian Liberation Organization. It basically began operations from southern Lebanon, and this really marked the whole conflict between Lebanon and Israel and led to all of the different cross-border attacks with Israel, lots of violence, and this is when Russia really started to enter the mix. From the Russian side, it needed to control the Mediterranean Sea, which is what this is really about, and why America needed to de-topple Syria and engaged in covert regime changes, and why Israel created groups like ISIS in order to create the war on terror to justify all of the wars and massacres to make sure that the Middle East was always in a state of unrest, and that America and Britain and Israel could use the oil resources to forward its agenda. So in 1971, there was a Soviet-Syrian agreement signed. And this is, remember, the Soviet Union, which was communism that was implemented to take down Russia, bankrupt the Russian government through the debt-based Rothschild banks as well. And this was used in order to create the whole Cold War so that Rothschild could fund both sides of the war. And within Syria, there was an agreement to put a territory, a Russian-controlled or Soviet Union-controlled territory, which is called Tartus. I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, during the Cold War as well. So there needed to be control of the there needs to be control of the Mediterranean Sea on the side of the communist Soviet Union side. And then there needed to be control of the other routes through the Federal Reserve, communist, socialist Federal Reserve side that was transforming America from capitalism into socialism. But this was used in order to support the Soviet Navy's basically fifth operation squadron in the Mediterranean Sea, which was seen as a counter resistance to the other side, which they saw was eventually a counterbalance to the US Sixth Fleet headquarters, which was in Italy for the Mediterranean seaside. Right. So now you know the early creation of terrorism. It was Israeli Haganah Irgun operations. Now you know the history of how Israel started to expand. You understand that the Rothschild banking cartels through the Federal Reserve and the Bolshevik Revolution and stealing the gold of of Britain through World War One, and the Treaty of Versailles taking out all of Germany's gold and Russia's gold through communism and the Soviet Union, all ended up in Fort Knox at the Federal Reserve. Rewind forward. Now we get to Hezbollah, so we can understand where we are today. It's now 1982, and Israel, through this violence and back and forth border, Israel decided to launch an invasion into Lebanon. This was known as the First Lebanese War, and this was to fight against the Palestinian Liberation Authority, which was the resistance movement to make sure that that there was no genocide and ethnic cleansing in both now the West Bank and ever smaller and smaller West Bank through illegal settlements, and also Gaza as well. And this resulted in a really, really prolonged Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon. And this is when Iran started to fund Hezbollah so that it could have some leverage to ensure that Israel does not invade Iran, where America was having more and more military bases surrounding Iran, and Hezbollah on the borders of Israel could then be used in order to stop Israel from ethnically cleansing and genociding the Palestinians and the Gazans and the West Bankans. And so Hezbollah was receiving weapons. Where were those weapons received? It was received through the Soviet Union controlled port in Syria through the Mediterranean Sea in order to create what is the pre-October the 7th order that was leading to the Palestinian cause being preserved so that Israel could not ethnically cleanse or genocide them at the time. And so that is the importance of Syria in the current conflict. And now let's forward a little bit more so that we can connect this to what's happening in Ukraine and Russia when you follow the money rather than listen to the propaganda of the media. We're now in 1991. It's the fall of the Soviet Union. It was bankrupted by the Rothschild-funded revolution of the Bolsheviks that led to hundreds, almost 100 million deaths through violence, destruction, and disgusting ideology of the communism. And obviously that leads to the bankruptcy and the fall of the Soviet Union. This is when you started to get all of the oligarchs that would then privatize the Soviet Union's assets. They would then launder it through like Cypriot banks. And that's why you had in 2013 the Greek debt crisis created by the IMF in order to have a bail-in in Cyprus. And in 2013, they confiscated all the Russian oligarchs' bank accounts above 100K so that they could launder all of that money that was taken from the Soviet Union and the oligarchs. And then you had the new regime that was fighting against the debt-based monetary system within now what was called Russia, the breaking up, and then you had Ukraine and all these different regions that were created. As a result, and all the peace agreements that were signed, for example, Ukraine to be a neutral zone away from NATO agreed that it wouldn't expand to any of the territories, like when Poland joined and various other regions joined, and it just got larger and larger and larger in violation of the end of the Cold War peace agreements as well. Right, that's 1991. Let's forward a little bit closer. We're getting closer and closer to today. This is the year 2000. This is the year that I started to really start to follow the money because my father lost all of his money in the dot-com boom and bust. I then went to university to study economics and then got a job in the city and then left in order to cover topics on monetary reform. And then the global financial crisis happened several years later. But we're back to 2000. This is when Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon. This is when we had basically 2 decades of occupation from Israel within Lebanon as well. They started to retreat. We had this 1701. There were tensions with Hezbollah, and they remained, and the 1701 agreement was never put into place. And so by 2006, now Hezbollah controlled that region in southern Lebanon. In 2006, we had what was called the Second Lebanon War. This broke after Hezbollah basically captured 2 Israeli soldiers. This is why you know what October the 7th was, because the strategy has always been hostage soldiers and then negotiate peace treaties. That's what October the 7th was. And if you haven't watched on my blog, go to Atrocity Inc., the documentary that explains why atrocity was used to lie to you on what happened on October the 7th to justify what came next, which is really an escalation of war to get regime change in Iran and pull America into the war through false flag operations. October the 7th happened, but all of the lies and things that didn't happen because it was meant to be a hostage swap, as was the case when in 2006, Israel invaded Lebanon. 2 soldiers were captured so that Hezbollah could negotiate peace, retreat Israel so that Israel could never engage in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine because Iran managed to have control over the border by supporting Hezbollah and the axis of resistance as well. And this ended in a cross-border raid. This conflict lasted for about 34 days now. And this caused basically a significant destruction within Lebanon. This is when we saw what we saw the 3rd time round this time, and also problems in northern Israel. And they retreated because they couldn't win the ground invasion, as happened recently as well. Right, now, how does this all relate to the Syrian side and the ceasefire that we've got? Now we're in 2011. This is, after the global financial crisis. This is before the Greek debt crisis. This is when Lehman Brothers was in Chapter 11. This is when BlackRock was being used in order to bail out banks on taxpayers' money, handed over to the shareholders of the Federal Reserve, create the quantitative easing pump and dump scheme, and all those things. But anyway, in 2011, we had the Arab Spring, which was basically a covert operation through the Muslim Brotherhood by the CIA and Mossad, funding the overthrow of certain regimes in Libya. This is when Gaddafi was trying to create a non-debt-based currency within Africa, backed by gold. We already had, that it said there was agreements that the CIA was going to overthrow and create carnage in Sudan. It was going to invade Iraq. It was going to eventually get to Iran. It was going to do Yemen. And all of these were released as documents on WikiLeaks. So it was always the plan to use covert regime change, false flag operations to fool people into justifying why they are killing people within the Middle East in order to fight this multi-front war. This is when you had Al-Qaeda, because it was converted into, basically in the Iraq War, they took over all of the weapons that were left over when Saddam Hussein was essentially taken out after US supported him to weaken Iran. You ended up with these groups at Al-Qaeda that then went over to ISIS. They were then supported by Mossad. And suddenly you have the ISIS invasion into Syria, which is controlled by Israel in order to detopple and take over that regime. Hezbollah, which were located in Lebanon, then decided to fight against ISIS within Syria. And you ended up with this incredibly complicated, multi-front, multi-regime group that destroyed the Syrian economy when the Syria basically was one of the fastest growing economy with a debt-free central banking system, and they managed to take the whole regime down. Now let's take a little bit of a collect. Let's make sure that this is all connected to understand where we are today. We're now in 2014. In 2014, there was a CIA-backed coup within Ukraine, which essentially overthrew the pro-Russian government in Ukraine. And that was Yanukovych, and he had to flee. And it was replaced with a pro-US puppet government in Ukraine in order to expand NATO right upon Russia's borders as well. This is when you had an outbreak of the basically 2014 Russo-Ukrainian war as well. We were told it started in 2022, and he was coming in for no reason whatsoever. In 2019, this is when the pro-US puppet was replaced by Zelensky in order to expand NATO for the military-industrial complex, which essentially is almost where we are today. We're now in 2020, so park that, have that in mind. You've got Syria strategic. You've got the CIA that's engaging in multiple operations. You got the creation of ISIS and expansion into Syria. You've got Hezbollah that were fighting against ISIS and resisting to keep peace, to stop Israel from committing genocide within Palestine. And then now you're on 2020. Trump is in power. He announces the Abraham Accords. He said that Israel is going to normalize with Saudi Arabia, not have a Palestinian cause, remove the nuclear deal, which was the peace agreement between America and Iran. And Israel said, we need our illegal nukes, but we don't want you opening up, and we want to basically, we'll use our illegal nukes to take down Iran if you have a nuclear deal with Iran. Destabilize the region, because Israel strategically needs to make sure that it has a puppet government installed. And in 1979, the US puppet government and British puppet government was overthrown by the Iranian Revolution. Abraham Accords was seen as the end of the Palestinian cause that would lead to the genocide and the change in order by not having this function as well. We're almost there. We're now in 2022. Russia invades Ukraine. In 2023, we had Hamas that would launch a hostage swap and their operation. And then that led to October the 7th because they thought they were going to be completely ethnically cleansed. Saudi Arabia was applied pressure. That was because, remember, when the Houthis created the oil crisis by going into Saudi Arabia, that led to US militarizing, creating a tragedy, a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis in Yemen, or Ansarallah. Then they were able to target the oil reserves in Saudi Arabia. That pushed the price of oil up significantly. And Trump decided not to go to war for that. Saudi Arabia weren't happy. They want to have their own nukes. They want a NATO-style nuclear deal. They want to normalize with Israel and Saudi Arabia, but this stopped this led to the tearing up of the nuclear deal that was under the Trump administration, and then they weren't happy about that, and this led to problems between closing the Abraham Accords deal. Biden administration then suddenly comes through. Now Saudi Arabia couldn't normalize with Israel because they said, Israel, if you ethnically cleanse or genocide the Palestinians, then my people will uprise. I'll end up with a Saudi Arabian revolution. This will happen across the whole region. So what are you going to do to the Palestinian cause? This is when that was why Abraham Accords didn't fall through. And then we ended up with October the 7th and the hostage swap, which still hasn't been resolved. Obviously, Israel decided, let's not focus on return the hostages. Let's allow it to happen. Let's Hannibal directive happen. The IDF, through the Apache helicopters, started killing their own people, engaged in atrocity propaganda, got Biden to say there were 40 beheaded babies when there weren't, started to say all the stories. Then IDF soldiers started to say they were, mass grapes. I don't want to say that word. That will get us banned. And then you had all of the fake news go out, and the justification after Israel left them for 7 years, not 7 years, left them for like 7 hours, so that they could justify what they wanted to do next, which is a set of events to genocide and ethnically cleanse Palestine, get US to support the operation, take over natural gas supplies, take out Hezbollah leadership, so that eventually they could focus on regime change in Iran and force US under a Trump administration to protect Israel. And so you can have Abraham Accords, Abraham Alliance, NATO expansion, and you can have nukes across Saudi Arabia, across Israel. You can have the energy through natural gas from Lebanon and Gaza, and you can have the oil from Iran in order to expand NATO in the Middle East, and then start focusing on China as well through the chips in Taiwan. So October the 8th, 2023, Hezbollah came along and said they fired a rocket into one of the disputed territories. It's always reported that Hezbollah fired into Israel. They didn't. They fired into the disputed Shiva Farms. Shiva Farms is disputed territory between Lebanon and Syria. And they said, we will continue to fire and escalate until Palestine is free. And so Israel then retaliated, and we ended up with the tit for tat and the slow escalation between Lebanon that eventually led to the Israeli invasion into Lebanon to distract people from the genocide and the forced famine and the cutting off of all food and aid and all the tricks. And now even allowing ISIS into Palestine in order to have these different bases and fund these different bases to make sure that it looks like they're not committing a genocide. But now we're up to multiple mass casualties and whatever they think the solution that Trump's going to solve here. Now, this is when we had the connection between some of the macro events I was talking about earlier. The terms of engagement right now, Russia says that it will agree to support Iran with equal proportion to what US supports Ukraine and EU supports Ukraine. And so by having this NATO expansion, that led to the invasion, that led to the doubling of everyone's budget, supporting the military-industrial complex. BlackRock and UK underwrite it all, and now BlackRock companies own approximately 47% of Ukraine. China says that in order to remain and support whatever's happening, they continue to buy oil from both Iran and Russia, which subsidize Iran and Russia, and they continue to get gas as well. Now China has built up the largest reserves of oil and natural gas in order to be able to, in case there is a tax on the oil price, be able to balance that out, just as America can drill, baby, drill, and Trump can campaigns. And then now Trump in his administration says we need a negotiation. And so he says we're going to implement tariffs and we're going to escalate the trade war with China. And that will be used as a negotiation tool in order to try and put all of this together so that we can give BlackRock half of Ukraine. Russia can take the other half of Ukraine. We can then redeploy those resources over to the Israel first policy of allowing for the regime change with Iran. And if you assassinate Trump, he's already said to all of his MAGA supporters, it's because Iran assassinated me. And if you don't, and if you do anything against that, then Israel has full control over Trump policy. And we'll see whether Trump stands against the deep state, bringing us to my theses of what I've been covering today. Now, let's make sure we understand why was there a ceasefire and why are we told that we need to now all focus on Syria in the media. There was a few announcements just to bring this to the present this week. There was an announcement from Russia that said, quote, the United States is using Taiwan to provoke a serious crisis in Asia. And so the quote says, we see that Washington, in violation of the one China policy and principle that is recognized, is strengthening military political conflicts with Taipei under the slogan of maintaining status quo and increasing arms surpluses to Taiwan. And so that's Russia's version of the story, and it really checks in when you follow the money. We also this week, remember I said there was massive escalation last week towards nuclear? Well, Ukraine decided to file another 10 US-made ATA CMS missiles into Russia, into the region. And we had announcements now that the UK and France are going to be in talks to deploy UK troops and French troops into Ukraine, as Ukraine started to lower that now, because they've got no arms force left, or very few, they're looking after 18-year-olds. And so this is just leading, all of this funding is leading to the killing of more and more Ukrainians. And exactly as we have seen in previous conflicts, with the military-industrial complex profiting from it all. Now, who is the peacekeepers in the Trump administration that commented on this? Well, we had comments from Mike Waltz. He is Trump's administration national security official. This week, he came out and said that Trump's administration is working hard is hand in glove with the Biden administration on Ukraine. So he's saying that everything that's happening with Ukraine right now, that the Trump is trying to blame on Biden, saying, why are you sending all of this money? And the neocons in the Trump administration are saying that the Trump administration and the Biden administration, they are working hand in glove as more and more weapons are going and more funding is going to Ukraine prior to the Trump administration coming into power. Who else did we see from the Trump administration? There was a quote from Sebastian Gorka. He is the counterterrorism advisor for the Trump administration, for the president-elect. He said that the first step to bringing the Russians to the table for negotiation, even though they wanted to be in negotiation, is to give them so much military aid, i.e. send as much money as possible over to Ukraine, that it makes all of the previous aid look like it is nothing in comparison. So this is inflationary policy. Billions and billions are going to go over to Ukraine, and they want to make, in the final months leading up to Christmas and January 20th, when the Trump administration comes in, they want to create as much inflation and send as much of US printed money in for the profits of the US military industrial complex, so that BlackRock can get more control. And this is the Trump administration that is saying the neocon talking points that led us here in the first place. At the same time, we're led to believe that the US President Trump, his team, is proposing halting all US weapons deliverable to Ukraine if they do not enter into peace talks with Russia. That was announced today. Follow the money? Nothing like that. The West have been making sure that there are no peace talks. And Boris Johnson went over to ensure that that doesn't happen. And the money is saying we need as much money to go to Ukraine, while at the same time, the Trump administration is saying they're going to halt it all if you don't engage in conversations. Russia's Dmitry Medvedev, he came out and said that NATO and the US are all in full war mode with Russia. And so he's saying that now UK and US are involved as UK looks to deploy troops, according to the announcements. And they have created an they have crossed all red lines by allowing Ukraine to use long-range missiles within Russia. Putin came out and said that Donald Trump is a smart and experienced person who will come up with a solution to end the war in Ukraine. So that is being sent from the Russian side as well. And Russian decided that because these long-range missiles came in, that Russia would not only launch that new weapon, which was next-level alien technology that we saw last week, but also decided to fire massive strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure as well. And this led to large blackouts across Ukraine so that the Ukrainians could not access any of their energy. At the same time, we led to the ceasefire talks. Right, so all of that's happening in Russia and Ukraine. In Tel Aviv, we had what led to this ceasefire? Well, this is when, remember the propaganda we're being told, while superior intelligence took out a lot of Hezbollah's leadership, mass bombardment took out a lot of Lebanese civilians and infrastructure, but Hezbollah was kicking ass on the ground when Israel tried to do the ground invasion, and this was leading to mass deaths and civilian casualties, not civilian casualties, IDF casualties as a result as well. Now, in order to prove that they still had the power, because remember, Netanyahu said that 80% of all the weapons have been dismantled because they were pretending that they were taking out Hezbollah's military bases when they were killing civilians and they were taking out those buildings. Right up the day before the ceasefire, Hezbollah fired not just rockets this time, but missiles 5 times in one day, and 350 missiles made their way into Tel Aviv, and Israel was trying to make sure that no one did it. Half the population, millions of people had to all go into bomb shelters. And this is why the very next day you had an emergency announcement from President Biden that actually we can't say that Hezbollah has been demilitarized when they're firing across missiles and they are getting through and the Iron Dome has failed. And so millions of people were in shelters and they did not achieve their strategic goal. And so Biden had to said, we have negotiated peace despite in the United Nations, they were veto voting all of it. They get the media propaganda coming out and saying that they have now achieved peace. And then Netanyahu goes back to his people saying, we have achieved victory. The people are like, what are you talking about? We haven't returned the hostages back. He's like, well, pretending that he's trying to return the hostages. And all of the people start rioting in Israel saying, but you didn't take down Hezbollah. They managed to get through to Tel Aviv. But, you know, they wanted to put out all of that propaganda. So then he was saying behind, don't worry, it's only 60 days. We're not really, this isn't really a ceasefire. We just got to let the American people pretend it is so that Biden can say that he did it. And then in 60 days, the Trump administration will be in place. And then we can get back to what we said we're going to do. We're going to take out Iran. And we're going to annex the West Bank because Trump said that that's what he would deliver to the AIPAC handlers that are handling him right now, while he says, I'm going to negotiate peace. Again, I don't mind being wrong. I'm just telling you the analysis from following the money rather than following the words. So Hezbollah, one day before the ceasefire, they were more aggressive than ever. They were getting right through. They were doing missiles instead of rockets. And so Israel decides to retaliate by bombing Syria. And now all eyes are on Syria. They decided to go all out aggressive in the final hours. They said the ceasefire will happen on the particular day. And so Israel went all out on Lebanon and did their worst bombardment, take out as many buildings as they could, did more and more civilian massacres and casualties, and deployed more and more aggressive action within Syria as well. Now that ties the border negotiation. Now Russia, Israel, China, Syria, Mediterranean Sea, Hezbollah contained, meaning that doesn't stop Israel committing genocide on the Palestinians. More and more massacres, more and more mass starvation, more and more atrocities, more and more crimes against humanity. Even the IC, Biden has to come out and say, we're going to sanction the courts, because even the courts are saying you are committing weaponizing starvation and crimes against humanity. And the genocide case is having more and more countries join it. Biden has to say, we're going to even. It's not happening. It's none of that is happening. We're going to sanction the courts for you. And that is the promise of the Trump administration as well. So more and more aggression in Lebanon and more. And then we have the ceasefire. And what were the words that Netanyahu was saying? We can now focus on Iran. They didn't say peace. And they led it where they can go in as they choose. Now, what did the media say today, yesterday, last few days? All of a sudden, Syrian rebels, they're currently trying to overthrow the Syrian government. Remember, these were the Syrian rebels where, if you look at all the WikiLeaks document, these are the ones that were getting help with Mossad agents. And we have Mossad agents that were pretending to behead people on cameras and say that they were the Syrian rebels and ISIS. And suddenly, we're getting all of this incursion trying to overthrow the government. What does that normally lead to? That normally leads to justification and false flag operations. So in response, Russia is now carrying out massive airstrikes within Syria, trying to protect its grounds, as we've got groups which are being called mass rebels, and now we're being told ISIS is returned, despite the fact that Trump campaigned on taking them out when it was about protecting the oil to create the CIA Mossad slush fund in order to have non-congressional money that can fund all of these groups that they pretend are their enemies when they're being weaponized and used in false flag operations and covert regime changes. So now they need to take out Syria, and this is all part of the negotiation as well. This could quickly escalate very fast because now Russia is deploying to protect its port. That is what's holding it together. And now Israel has successfully escalated by now not having the protection of Hezbollah that can stop the genocide, continue to exert the genocide, and now install and push ISIS into Syria to overthrow the Bashar al-Assad government so that they can pull US in, so that more and more US troops can be deployed, so that then they can get to the Trump administration, and within 1 week, the 60-day ceasefire ends, which could then start to use the deploying of those US troops in order to create a false flag operation. And all of a sudden, everyone needs to go to war with Iran in order to overthrow the Iranian regimes. It is believed that the groups that are now operating and expanding to overthrow the government within Syria are Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The Mossad and CIA and MI6-backed groups that were originally deployed in order to create the Cold War and the fake war on terror, so that anyone that was resisting war could be called terrorists. and they could make it look like the CIA-controlled organizations are the ones that we need to fight because those crazy Muslims are going to behead us. Then you get all of the civil unrest in the UK that leads to Patriot Act, that leads to all of the laws that are needed to get through the digital ID, to get through artificial intelligence, that can then, the Fed can take down the banking system through hiking rates, that leads to the collapse of banking, the replacement of banks with a central bank digital currency. And if you can have the NATO expansion throughout the Middle East, this can have the Abraham alliance of Saudi Arabia and Israel, nuclear powered, to take over all of the energy that's needed. And you could take out America at any time by hiking rates, getting the world into World War III, just as they did with Britain in World War I. And if anyone has their plans, I'm not saying they'll succeed at it, but Israel could implement their central bank digital currency powered by artificial intelligence with the collapse of the American economy through the control of the Federal Reserve, and blame President Trump on the fall of the US empire if it wanted to, or it could just continue pumping the Ponzi scheme and the debt-based monetary system that it now controls at the moment, and draw America closer and closer to communism when the Fed has its own central bank digital currency as well. So beware of these rebels, and beware of the false flag operations, and beware of whatever happens in the Trump administration, and we will keep covering it. And that needs to be connected to the macro side, all of these negotiations with tariffs, all of these different things, because we can see where this is headed, and it can go any way, and we'll keep following the money to try and stay ahead as well. So apparently these rebel groups have now taken control of at least 10 areas that were previously government controlled, and we are getting the overthrow of the government within Syria, which can be used at any time to escalate Russia, because Russia has to protect it, which then ties into the Ukrainian side as Trump attempts to end that side, and they can try and get leverage into the negotiations of the tariffs that we were covering in the macro side. The president of Syria, Assad, basically decided to travel to Russia to meet with President Putin, and that was on a visit as well. What's going to happen next? Well, we'll continue to follow the money. Let's summarize it briefly. The forecast from following the money so far, BlackRock is going to own half of Ukraine. Russia's going to have other strategic regions, and Trump is going to have to negotiate a end of Cold War style agreement that stops NATO and the deep state expanding long term. Very, very, very hard to achieve. Trump said he'll do it within 24 hours of coming into power. And that needs to be a long-term agreement that doesn't lead to the same thing. Unless, of course, you have a bunch of CIA neocons in the Trump administration that want to support the military-industrial complex and allow the NATO to expand for the profits and continue to prompt the Federal Reserve to get the US government deeper into debt to expand the money supply and create wealth inequality, and why you need to protect yourself with Bitcoin. Is Trump planning to leverage this all together into annexing the West Bank once he's in power? Well, that was the alleged promise that he made to the Adelson family when the AIPAC and Zionist-controlled funders said, we'll make you the next president of the United States, and we'll persuade all of the left-winging Silicon Valley pundits like Peter Thiel and Bill Ackman, that are also creating companies like Palantir, that it was creating the AI that's going back to Israel to create occupation as a service and genocide as a service for the profits of Palantir. We'll take all of those people over and they'll back you, and obviously Elon Musk as well will back you, and we can get there. So we got this whole thing. The neocon warmongers, the deep state is the administration, and we're told that Trump is going to take back control, fight against it, and create peace. Now, how do you create peace when there are a bunch of Palestinians in the West Bank and you're going to annex it and hand it over to Israel, allow them to continue their illegal settlements? That is the operation that you will create, a false flag operation by pretending that Hezbollah retaliated. Then you can go into the aggression. You can say that they broke the ceasefire. You can then annex the West Bank. That will create an uprising, and that uprising will draw the US into protecting Israel. And then that will create the environment that is needed in order to get America deep into the regime change within Iran, which is Israel's original goal. And so Netanyahu came out and he told in Hebrew, not in English, and he told and was speaking to his extremists within the Likud party, which is the party that were connected to Haganah and all the extreme terrorists and the back in the day that we covered in the original part, that this is not a ceasefire. It is a temporary refresh of weapons, an opportunity for some of the soldiers to take a little breather. And he said that they will be back to take the West Bank, and that they will be back to focus on their actual objective, which is to bomb Iran and draw America into the war. And so the 60 days coincides with 1 week after the Trump administration. And so expect false flags. We will watch it. And we shall see if Trump actually is what he said he is. And he's going to expose and come against the deep state. In the meantime, thank you for the pro-Bitcoin policy. We're going to protect ourselves. Thank you to the judicial system that protected people's rights in America to self-custody. And thank you to anybody that's going to support through a strategic reserve so that our countries can free themselves from the central banks. But we don't rely upon the political system because we know that there will be a big resistance to try and drive us into World War III to change the empire into a central bank digital currency. And if enough people own Bitcoin in self-custody, we can all resist and peacefully resist as our leadership takes us into complete deception. And we'll always follow the money in order to make sure that we know the truth and we're not falling for their words. And so maybe it's expected to be quiet for the rest of the Biden administration to hand over to Trump. But what does Biden do in his final little gestures? Well, it was announced this week that he approved $600 million in arms deals to Israel for their ceasefire and $24 billion of taxpayer debt-based inflation to be sent from the proof of weapons network of the Federal Reserve and debt-based Ponzi to be sent over for a package in Ukraine to make it work and come back for the profits of the US military-industrial complex, where BlackRock still owns all those shares because they managed to persuade you to hand over your pension to them so that they get the voting rights and board sheets of all Americans' pension shares, and they can push and control industry for their agenda. Iran started to come out and said that it will suspend its plans to strike Israel following the Donald Trump's election victory. And that was reported in the New York Times. Whether that's propaganda or not, whether that is genuine, we will not know. But following the money maybe says that that is what happened. But the quote was, Iran is now applying restraint to give Trump a chance to see whether he can end the Gaza war and contain Netanyahu, is the quote. We shall see. Can Trump contain Netanyahu? MAGA, will you hold Trump accountable to do everything that he says? Whatever happens, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Some are going to get wrecked. Others are going to do really well. And I want to make sure that you are on the right side of change, building your Bitcoin strategic reserves as your country build their Bitcoin strategic reserves to fight the Fed and the central banks, while companies protect themselves and build their strategic reserves. And we usher in a bottom-up movement, which maybe with peace, love, and unity, we can transition, but at least we can protect ourselves from that with peace. Head over to simondixon.com. Make sure you are signed up to the free Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. Follow me on X. I will make sure you are up to date in real time. Subscribe to my channel on YouTube and make sure that you are prepared as we enter into December and the final month of 2024. And we'll continue to follow the money. I may be traveling next week, so I might try and do this from a different location. But in the meantime, that's going to do it. That's everything for episode 66 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. And I will see you this time next week for episode 67. Peace.